One.
Hello and a very warm welcome to this panel on AI for labour market matching. I'm Emma Nelson and this panel is part of the 2022 OECD International Conference on AI in Work, Innovation, Productivity and Skills. It's hosted by the OECD and supported by the German Federal Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. All over this week we're being joined by more than 70 speakers and 3,500 registered participants from more than 100 countries. So thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to place comments, materials and questions into the chat during today's session. We'll be connecting you and collecting some of the questions to ask our panelists later on. So please do listen and come up with some ideas to further the discussion. The purpose of this week is to broaden and to deepen the debate that the impact artificial intelligence has on work, on innovation, productivity and skills, and just importantly as on the policies that we make to try to make AI more trustworthy, effective and beneficial to absolutely everyone. Now, let me set the context for today's panel. There are millions and millions of jobs available. There are millions and millions of people looking for jobs. Bringing these two together to form a successful relationship brings us a more stable workforce. It brings us a stronger labour market and lower unemployment. But it's not a very easy job to do. And the hope is that technology, like artificial intelligence, can help us with this job. When it is done right, AI can help us find, hire and train the right workers. Get it wrong and you have issues of productivity, reputation and recruitment. It can lead to a higher turnover in staff. There's the extra expense of starting the recruitment process all over again, and the unemployment figures start to rise. Your algorithm may be screening out what it believes to be the perfect candidate, but a survey conducted by Harvard University showed that nearly 9 out of 10 executives said that they know the software that they use to filter applicants stops them from seeing some good candidates. There is a distinct possibility that the next time someone receives a recruiting email, that communication may have been generated by artificial intelligence. So this session is going to explore the use of artificial intelligence in labour market matching by human resource managers, public and private employment services, as well as on the platform economy as well. We'll be looking at the potentials and the risks, and we'll also look at where policy and regulation can also fit in. To do this for the next hour, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Anna Milanez, a labour market economist at the OECD. She joins us on the line from Paris. Hello, Anna. Wim Adriens is from the Flemish Public Employment Service, VDAB in Belgium. Hello, Wim, where it is just gone 10 to 4 in Brussels. Glenn Cathy is the head of digital strategy at the recruitment and employment agency Randstad. Glenn, I believe it's a nice early bright morning in Tampa, Florida for you. Good morning. Matissa Hollister is from McGill University. And Nicolas Blanc is from the CFE-CGC, the French Confederation of Management. Welcome to you, Nicolas. And finally, Anna Banchuk is Deputy Head of Unit Future of Work, Youth Employment at the European Commission's Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. Welcome, Anna. And finally, we're joined by Stijn Brucker, who's Senior Economist and Lead of Future Work Initiative at the OECD in Paris. Stijn will be joining us at the end of this hour session to sum up and to give his view of about what's been said. Before we begin, let us run a poll. We want to know a little bit more about what you think about matching and artificial intelligence. It's about how comfortable you feel about the growing role played by artificial intelligence in recruitment. And we're really keen for you to tell us what you think. We'll be running the poll, and as soon as we get the results, I'll bring them to you and we'll talk about them as part of the discussion. It's a really, really easy question, and you should be able to answer this quite simply in the interactivity chat box on the right hand side of the screen that you're looking at now. I hope that is simple and clear enough to you. The questions are, I've got 2 questions. Firstly, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable with AI shortlisting the candidates? I'll repeat that question. If you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable with AI shortlisting the candidates? The second question is, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable being interviewed by AI? That question is, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable about being interviewed by AI? We'll find out a little bit more about how you feel about this a little bit later. But let's begin now by hearing from Anna Milanez. She's here to talk about what the OECD has been finding out about the impact of AI on the labour market in the last 12 months and what we can learn for it. Anna, all yours.
Hi, Emma, and thank you very much. I'd like to speak to a recent paper by two colleagues at the OECD that looked at the link between AI and employment. And what they found is that the presence of AI is good for the job prospects of some candidates, but not all, and potentially bad for those of others. And so what makes the difference between those two groups is really skills that are required in jobs. They found evidence of job growth in occupations that required a high degree of computer use. But in occupations that required a low degree of computer use, they found a greater prevalence of part-time work. And that suggests that those workers who don't have the skills to work with advanced technologies like AI might not be getting the hours that they want in their jobs, and they might not be getting the jobs that they want. And for policy, this is important because it boils down to potential disparity in the labor market. Again, those that have the skills to work with AI find good jobs, no problem. Those that don't risk getting left behind. And I thought that this paper and these findings would be a really good introduction to today's panel, because in the context of labor market matching, AI has the potential to be a solution to a problem like this. When we think about labor markets in general, we know that key to their ability to function is the efficiency of matching. And a lot is being made of the potential for AI in this space to improve efficiency. Now, what do I mean about efficiency? I mean two things. The first is speed. And we know that AI, especially working with big data, has the potential to really revolutionize the pace with which vacancies are matched with job candidates. And the faster that that happens, as you mentioned, the more robust the impact on employment is going to be. So there's speed, there's also quality, and quality is as important as speed. We know that AI also has the potential to improve the quality of labor market matches, and that's important because it could boost productivity if people are better suited to the jobs that they do, their skills are better suited to the tasks that they're required to perform. It could also boost retention if people are more fulfilled in the work that they do. And again, all of this comes back to the potential to boost employment. So there's a lot of potential here and a lot of optimism. At the same time, some of the claims of what AI is capable of isn't really backed up by hard data and evidence. We're also aware of certain risks that are widely discussed. That includes biased treatment of certain groups, potential dehumanization of the recruitment process, also real concerns about the accuracy of tools like facial recognition, voice recognition, ability to detect and analyze emotions. And so the question that we're really asking in this panel, and then it's also the topic of the research project that's underway at the OECD, is how can we maximize the gains of AI for labor market matching while minimizing some of these potential harms? And in our approach to this question, we're kind of stepping away from the style of research, this macro type study of the kind that I introduced, to look in concrete detail of some of the applications. So that's the basis upon which we've invited the panelists to discuss today, and I really look forward to getting into the details with them.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Anna. Let's get down to the details. Wim, can I begin with you? You're in the Flemish Public Employment Service, known to be a front runner in the use of AI. Can you give us a few examples of where you have been using AI and how it's helped you?
Well, as a government organization focusing on facilitating the match between employers and unemployed people, we use AI to broaden the perspective of the unemployed as well as the employers to create more matching possibilities. For instance, we use AI to offer personalized matches to vacancies, not only based on the CV, but also we make use of the information of other experiences of the candidate or interests of the citizens, and we use that information to make a broader range of suggestions to a candidate. We also use AI to make other suggestions. For instance, when a citizen selects a vacancy that he or she finds interesting, we use AI to offer similar vacancies. The same at the side of the employer. If you give up a vacancy, but offering you a candidate, we will not only stick to the vacancy alone, we will also offer you similar candidates than the ones you looked into. And that's the way we try to broaden the perspective and make sure that people are not always looking for the same people, but also consider a wider variety of candidates. Later this year, we would like to propose to an employer also not only a candidate that doesn't entirely match the vacancy, but we will combine this with a training offer so that this person would be a better match to the vacancy. So that's the way how we try to make use of AI to offer better possibilities. We also developed a model that predicts job seekers' distance to the labor market. And we use this model ourselves to prioritize our calling lists. So this way we can reach out first to the job seekers with the largest distance to our labor market, so we can help them first. So that's another way how AI helps us to make better priorities. It's important to mention that we always have a human-centric approach. So it's not the machine replacing the decision process for the individual. It supports the decision process. Finally, it will always be the human who makes the call, but based on richer information and more possibilities.
Wim, thank you very much indeed for that. To my panelists now, if you hear something that one of your fellow panelists says and you wish to respond, you have a burning desire to say something, please don't worry about it. Just put your hand up, a little bit like you're in school, and I'll bring you in, because I want this to be as much of a natural and lively debate. So there's Wim trying to match people from all walks of life to all kinds of jobs. Let me move to you, to you, Glenn, in Florida. You're working in the private sector now in Randstad. You're increasingly adopting AI as well. What opportunities have you seen that it's brought to you?
Well, I first have to say at Randstad, our goal is to be the lifelong partner for our customers. And historically, recruitment can be somewhat transactional. But we believe that technology combined with our recruiters' understanding of talent is really the optimum way. We call this essentially tech and touch. Essentially what Wim had just mentioned, we believe that it's not a replacement. AI and automation can be essentially a very good way to augment people's capabilities and also accelerate the touch. I would say some of the main opportunities that we see for AI, just some examples would be programmatic advertising that's helping place job ads where they're going to be seen by relevant candidates and where they can attract more of the right talent, including diversity. I'd say improving the inclusivity of job descriptions, parsing for structured data, skills and experience, of course, matching, what Wim just talked about. Also skilling and reskilling, identifying skill gaps, recommending training and career paths, which was already mentioned as well. One example I'd like to spend a little bit more time on has to do with screening and scheduling. It's one of the main things that we do with AI at Randstad. It's our Relevate chat engine, and we improve experience and ultimately find the right job for the right candidates. Also improving transparency and convenience and immediate feedback to people who are applying to jobs. This has a human-in-the-loop approach. There's no automated decision-making. The questions are actually fully determined by people. They're just executed within the chat. We use AI, of course, for natural language understanding and processing. This allows for us to offer an experience to 100% of applicants, 24/7, any time of day, reduces the black hole. Also, just to give some scale, we're talking about so far lifetime, about 3 million conversations, of almost 1 million interviews scheduled, over 250,000 hires directly attributable to this. It also had a 51% decrease in the time to submit talent to hiring managers. So we're able to use technology in this case to literally accelerate touch.
Wonderful. Okay. Let's move on to you, Matisa. Both panelists there have talked about how it acts as a complement, which is to recruitment, which is arguably ultimately a human business. And using AI is something that has become an incredibly important part of recruitment as well, whether it's throwing jobs out or whether it's selecting potential candidates very quickly. How much of a good thing do you think this really is? Or are we looking at something which is an inevitable development because it is quick, but it becomes a tool which has its own risks as well?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of different thoughts on that. I think, of course, one thing to keep in mind, we do worry about the dehumanizing of HR. But on the other hand, one thing to keep in mind is at the moment, I think that poll that you were discussing about the feeling that the people's software was screening out good candidates, some of that software is not AI, right? It's very simple keyword searches or filters. And so we're already using much simpler technology that is perhaps more problematic. So there's ways that you can use AI to move beyond the keyword filter, right? And I think that's where people see the promising aspects, is that we can we can do a better job of understanding people's skills than just looking at whether they put a very specific word in their resume, right? And that's going to improve the matching. But I think one of the things that this highlights is a bit of a trap that we fall into when we say, can artificial intelligence help this? I mean, artificial intelligence is a very broad term, as we've heard from the previous people who've talked, right? There's a million different tools that are all supposedly using artificial intelligence. They're all very different. I think we have an image in the world that artificial intelligence is this truly intelligent thing that somehow it's acting independently. And the reality is that AI in its current form is really kind of much more of a statistical type of tool that's looking for patterns. And what it actually does is very much based on the human programmers and creators. And that means that whether the tool works well or is problematic is really going to be based upon the ideas and the assumptions and the decisions that those human creators make. And so we see this a bit with the classic example that people like to point to. The problematic tool was Amazon's famous attempt to build a recruitment tool that was found to be biased. And that was kind of more of this approach of just sort of, we'll assume that the computer can figure things out. So we'll just dump a bunch of data on the computer and leave the computer to decide who's the best job candidate. And that's where we run into problems, both because of the potential for bias, right? We don't know why the computer decided this, and it's based on using past human decisions. So the computer could just be picking up human problems. But also, even beyond that, what we might end up with is a result where the human who's then supposed to act on that doesn't know why this particular person was chosen over somebody else, right? And so I think a much better approach, which still uses AI, is using AI as a tool to implement new ideas or ways that we could see to improve things, right? So we heard examples of this: debiasing job applications, identifying broader ways that we could advertise or get more diverse recruiters. And those are the humans who came up with these ideas of, we could make this process better if we could only do this. And AI is the process that allows us to process the information faster, to implement this idea that probably would have been way too time intensive, or we weren't quite sure how to get it to work. Like humans doing it wouldn't work. So we use AI to implement the human's idea of ways to make better matches. And so I do think that that's where there's this big potential, and matching is a great example of this, right? I've known companies that have used these tools internally in addition to recruitment, where they say, here's the job you're in right now, here's various paths that you could take in the future, right? And it's crunching a bunch of data that in the past that the company just didn't have the resources to do that. So I think there's great potential, but to sort of lump everything together and just say, is AI good or bad? I think that is too hard a question to answer, because how AI actually acts or how it's set up varies so widely from place to place.
Martita, thank you very much indeed. Let me bring in Nicola at this point. Nicola, when you look from the point of view of the employer, which we have done here, it seems it's moving incredibly fast. There are risks, there are rewards, but from the point of view of a candidate, how much of a real fair balance is there here?
Yes, thank you, Emma, for the question. But the first thing I would like to say is that HR managers are not going to disappear. I think it's important to understand that. However, that activities as HR manager are going to be profoundly modified. And I would like to take the example of the hiring process. Is very significant, because you have two kinds of tools for hiring process. You have the ATS, applicant tracking system tools. It will help the HR to analyze the resumes of a large number of employees. So it could be a very interesting tool, but but it's necessary to set selection criteria with a risk of bias and bias. So it's very important to be aware about the implementation of this tool. It's the first point I would like to tell. The second point, very important, is for the interviews from the candidate, because you have already some fun recruitment tools and that allows the use of AI to scrutinize the emotion of the candidate, the vocabulary level, and maybe the IQ or the stress level, something like that. So with biometric data, so it could be a risk, but thankfully the AI Act proposal as well identified the risk of this tool as high risk, and they identify this as in the proposal as a emotion recognition system and biometric categorization system. I think it's very important to have that in mind. And I think this tool for interview create an important asymmetry between the manager, the HR manager, for example, and the candidate. Because when you are a candidate, you want the job. It's like when you want to rent an apartment. you understand what I want to say. You are the little regard for your personal data, for your consent. So that will be an important asymmetry between them, and we need to inform the candidate about all the AI processes. I think it's very important to inform them how this data will be stored and whether it will be used by the algorithm data model, for example, to improve it. I think it's very important to keep in mind this point. So I think it's very important that the HR manager must remain in control of these processes because he must to explain the decision of the algorithm. That's why it's very important in the regulation. You have, for example, the AI Act proposal. You have explanation about emotional system or something like that. But the explainability is a point that HR manager will be able to explain the decision of the algorithm. Is very important from the candidate perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Nicolas. I mean, let's build on this a little bit more. You said that people who work in human resources, they still have a future to them, but what kind of future do they actually have? The question to you, Nicolas, is a future. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there that HR is not HR executives are not a dying breed, but what kind of job will they be doing in the future?
Yeah, I think the first question we have to ask is what is the main role of the HR manager, and the main role of HR manager is to adapt the workforce to the needs of the company. And they have to know the skill and job to come by training the employees in the best possible way. I think it's the main role for them. But we already have today very powerful tools like those proposed by Sky High, for example, which with the AI allows to have an adaptation in real time of the need of the company. And I quote their website. They created a quantum labor analysis with a methodology invented by them. It is an application of artificial intelligence to analyze workforce of the most granular skill level, and it delivers in real time skill level insight to analyze internal workforces and external labor market, identify future skill, and facilitate individual level and organization level reskilling. As you can see, it's a very powerful tool. It's very, very, very efficient, but normally that is done by the HR function, you understand? And it is an important part of their job. So it is a useful tool, but it can replace HR manager or even proximity managers. I think it's very important to keep in mind. And it can also create a form of algorithmic management for the worker. That's why I think the HR manager must remain in control of these activities. That's what I explained before. It's very important for the HR manager, they keep the control of this. And in France, we've been working on a project. It's called Sequoia Deal. It's serving confidence on AI by Deal. And we've been working on the future skills for any jobs. And we're trying to develop a methodology for that.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Nicola. We're getting lots of questions from you. Thank you very much indeed. And many of them are directed to you, Wim. I'll ask you one in a moment. But one thing that we're hearing more and more about in this discussions are the risks of AI. I mean, we began this session when we were talking about a Harvard survey where 9 out of 10 executives said that they know the software that they're using is filtering out some really good candidates. We've got issues of people moving between industries. Let's say you've been in the military or into the civilian world, or you're jumping in and out of the labor market and you have a gap in your CV. And as a result, you fall out. I mean, these are some of the risks. What risks are you spotting? And more importantly, what safeguards is your organization putting into your systems to make sure that people who are, for example, former military, or if you are someone who's taken time out to have children, for example, you don't slip through the AI crack?
Mm-hmm. Well, we strongly believe in the possibilities of AI, but of course we are also aware of the risks that it can entail. So we think the best option is to actively look for these risks and make sure that we try to manage them. So we start from using 3 ethical principles as a guideline: transparency, trust, and beneficial to all. So with transparency, we try to be open and honest about why and how we develop and use AI systems. And this is necessary to gain the trust for the people, that they don't have the feeling it's a black box and it might be disadvantage to me. No, this is what we're doing, and we explain it. And maybe the system may have some bad angles, but like Matissa said, the other systems we use today may be even worse, and we don't have that discussion there. So we try to be transparent about that. We will also try to gain trust, and we evaluate and test our AI systems for fair and responsible outcomes. So people can trust us to do the right thing. And with beneficial to all, we try to make the promise that we always aim at developing systems that benefit VDIB and the clients, and not only one or the other. Everybody must benefit from the system we install. And to meet these principles, we, together with an external partner called Yields, we made a model risk management framework to look out for the risks and to conduct these bias assessments for every AI product that's in production. For instance, if we use a variable like language proficiency, by correlation, you could have a bias concerning an ethnical group. So we think about that in advance. We try to identify the risk, and then we test our model actively to see if this bias does occur or not. So that's one check. We also check the data, if there are representative. For instance, it may occur that in our data, we only have young foreign people that have difficulty getting a job, but this may not match the reality. So we investigate the data, see if they match reality, and if we don't make the wrong conclusions about the data. But like Matissa said, in a way, this whole AI process helps us to detect bias that might be already in our data. And it's not AI introducing the bias, it's us discovering that there is a bias in the data because we're going to want them to use them for AI. So that's another way we cope with that. And on top of that, we want to go one step further now by building an external check on what we are doing in the field of AI. So we're going to set up an ethical advisory board, and they will monitor if we really are using AI in a responsible way. So this is a council where there will be experts based on AI, experts on ethics, and they will have the authority to refuse the deployment of an AI tool that we are considering. So that's an extra check we have to make sure that we're not doing the wrong things.
We'll move on to regulation in a moment. Yeah, Nicola, you wanted to say something briefly?
Yeah, I think we must have a strong regulation for this tool, because we must be vigilant in their implementation. I think regulation has an important role, as I explained before. Explainability, accountability, it's very important for that. We saw yesterday the presentation of the OECD framework for classification of AI system. I think it's an important tool, very operational tools, and holistic tools. In its approach, it could be very interesting tool, but now we must populate it to to make it real. I think it's important. We have obviously the GDPR for data privacy. I think it's very important to have privacy impact assessment. And because for employees, we have a risk to have no contact with HR or proximity manager, or to be controlled by a machine. I think it's very important. So we need the importance of a social dialogue to accompany this long-term project in company. I think it's fundamental. Hence, the importance of our Sequoia Deal project to create the future of the social dialogue with AI. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nicola. Anna, let me come to you. One of the first places where AI has been used for matching is somewhere like Uber, a ride-hailing app where you have AI matching drivers to passengers. Most of us don't even recognize that it's AI. And that kind of stuff is so important and so stitched into our culture now. What challenges do you see in this area where we have something which is already very, very established? And you have something like the recent EU proposal, the EU's AI Act, which is attempting to grapple with all this.
Thanks a lot. Yes, indeed, the digital labor platforms are the pioneers of the use of automated systems in matching between the demand and supply for labor. It is the ride-hailing or delivery platforms that we know, but also a range of other platforms that deal with tasks, from babysitting and gardening to design, translation, and programming. And for those platforms, the swift and efficient matching is like a cornerstone of their business model. Thanks to the algorithms, they are able to analyze loads of information about the customers that are using for service providers and about people who are available to do these kind of tasks. And at least in theory and often in practice, such a matching process is very beneficial for both sides. The customer gets access to the optimal service provider, and the person who is looking for jobs has nothing to do but just to accept or reject the task, and that's done. However, such a speed and efficiency, of course, comes also with some risks, and those risks are especially there for those who are the weaker side, so the people who work through platforms. As a platform worker, you depend on platform to get access to those tasks. How many tasks you're going to get, what is the quality of those tasks will determine how much you're able to earn, and how much time you're just going to spend and wait for work and not get paid at all. Such systems also might have an impact on other aspects of your working conditions. For example, platforms might use the algorithms to determine how long it should take, for example, for you to deliver something. And that in turn might, push you to write, faster than it is safe. So there is also an important aspect there. Unfortunately, often, you don't know what parameters are actually used in this matching process. Are these just purely objective facts? For example, how far you are situated from where the service needs to be delivered? Is it just your qualifications? Are you being maybe punished for rejecting a previous task? Are you being rewarded because you have worked, 10 hours in a row? What is the role of the ratings of your previous clients in all this? And are any other issues taken into account? Your emotional state, the tone of your voice, your driving style, are these play a role as well? So this kind of lack of clarity reinforces the power of the platform towards the platform worker. And at the same time, the platform worker might not have so much at his disposal to question and challenge such decisions. There were some, relevant pieces of legislation already mentioned, the GDPR, the AI Act. We think in the European Commission that, in the specific world of platform economy, where algorithms have such a determining role in shaping the working conditions, we need a little bit more and a little bit more specific. And that's why there has been this recent proposal for a directive on working conditions in platform work, which has a dedicated chapter on algorithmic management, and where we are trying to address some of those issues specifically. In a nutshell, what it says, first of all, it promotes transparency on the use of such systems. Platforms are supposed to inform workers that such systems are in use. What are the main parameters that are taken for decisions to be made? It also clarifies that platforms should not use any personal data that is not closely linked with the work that is done. For example, data on private conversations, on health or emotional state, or any data that is collected outside of the work context. Second, it obliges platforms to monitor and evaluate the impact of individual decisions supported by such systems on the working conditions. And here comes, the role of the undying HR manager to still monitor, to be involved in this process. And we say that it should be people who are actually properly trained and have the authority and are in a way also protected from any adverse consequences for overriding such automated decisions. It also gives the workers the right to obtain explanation of such decisions, the right to challenge those decisions, and possibly even receive a compensation for them. And then, because in platform work, often such systems almost take really the work of a manager, and some of those people should be actually employees of the platform. For those who are or should be in an employment relationship with the platforms, we also say that the platform should take into account the impact on health and safety of the algorithms, and also enable social dialogue, so that social dialogue can take place, and representatives of workers can be involved in putting in place such systems. So all in all, as I was saying, we see a lot of efficiencies in this sector where these kind of tools are already very, very predominant. They can help to build added value both for customers and for workers, but we think that a little bit more regulation is needed so that this is done in a fair way, and that it's not just about speed and efficiency, but also that the workers have a say in it and understand how it's done. Thanks.
Well, let's thank you very much indeed for that, Anna. Let's explore that a little bit more deeply in terms of regulation with Glenn and what appears to be his cat. Thank you to Glenn's cat for joining the session today. I mean, Anna has just been talking there about the increased rights of as people as AI takes on bigger roles as managers. But when it comes to regulation, we have this big problem, don't we? That we have more than 550 database products that you, as someone in the private sector, could all buy off the shelf. 30% of those came out in the last 2 years. So the technology is running and running and running ahead. You are all trying to catch up in the private sector. What regulation do you need to make sure that the decisions that you are making and you are ultimately accountable for as an employer, are going to be fair and correct?
That's a great question. We certainly recognize that the application of AI in certain areas of HR and recruiting are going to have the high potential for causing harm and damage to individuals. Some examples of that would be biased outcomes from automated decision making, but you also have to balance that out with the fact that AI can contribute to the fight on bias, which has been present in all human decision making historically. That's been brought up before. When we start to think about proposed legislative ambitions on AI for the EU, we think it could potentially lead to disproportionate regulatory burden on low-risk applications. Some of the ones I mentioned before, like CV parsers or job description analysis and improvement solutions, programmatic advertising, chatbots, and interview scheduling. We'd like to see more appropriate guidance for identifying true high-risk areas and classifying certain processes under this banner only. And that would be like individual background checks, deciding on offering an employment contract, rating systems of employees, and contract conditions. Also in that space would be something that was mentioned previously. The automated analysis of biometric and video data should definitely be deemed high risk. That's something we don't do at Randstad. We also have to recognize that there's technological solutions for minimizing data biases, and these have to be founded on real data sets with relevant demographic data to enable the measurement of bias in the first place. If we're going to take AI bias seriously, we're going to have dedicated and tailored frameworks for developers to collect relevant information and data sets so that they can test for safety and test in a compliant manner, including compliance within GDPR for bias, and be able to continually monitor for bias and mitigate it over time. That means that regulations are going to have to allow for options to use demographic data, because when it's prohibited to collect the data, it's pretty much not possible to measure or mitigate bias in the model for, like, say, for example, adverse impact. We think it would be nice to see some regulations, including norms and standards, which don't really particularly exist at the moment. We have to recognize that AI can't be 100% bias-free, and companies need to be supported in providing guidance on acceptable deviations. Also, when are bias mitigating measures enough? I would say, lastly, the full chain of parties involved in AI, should be allocated responsibility proportionally, not just for the users, but also for the tech providers that are creating the solutions. They need to be responsible for the products they offer the market, provide guidance and training to users to make sure they're using them in a fair and responsible manner.
Thanks, Glenn. I mean, it brings up the issue of fairness and bias, which is something that we discussed a couple of days ago in a separate panel. And a lot of people were talking about the fact that we have global companies now operating absolutely in all corners of the world. And Matisa, we've heard a little bit about what Anna was saying about what's happening in Europe. Just focus a little bit about what's happening in the United States and Canada. What's happening in terms of a regulatory perspective from there, and is it enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think that regulation, somewhat like in Europe, there's recognition and a movement in that direction. The US and Canada are a little bit different. Canada, on the one hand, was a early player to some extent in that they developed this algorithmic impact assessment, but this was focused on governmental use of AI, not private sector use. But they developed a tool that is trying to somewhat address Glenn's point about the fact that AI tools can vary widely in their risk level. And so the algorithmic assessment, impact assessment tool is designed to try to identify higher risk applications versus lower risk. And it, within the use in government, it sets different reporting and auditing requirements depending upon the level of risk. So I think that's a promising development that a number of organizations are beginning to look at as an interesting tool. But beyond that, I haven't seen much other regulatory movement in Canada. In the US, what we really see is just in the past year or two, a really heightened interest in regulation, but it hasn't really settled on where it's going. So we see some is at the state level. So we see Illinois, New York City, sort of independently passing regulatory laws. And then we see a lot of movement with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as the Biden's administration in looking to regulate AI, but how that's going to happen is not yet clear. And I think, you know, a big challenge in general is kind of what I pointed at before, which is that AI, you know, AI is like snowflakes, right? Every tool is different. And so what do we mean by regulating this? And on top of that, we have the challenge that how the system will perform because it's learning from training data. Every time it's applied, it might have a different outcome. So there's a variety of questions of what are we going to regulate? And then we also have the question of who's responsible, the tech provider or the company. So there's many, many things to work out still. I think there is actually one positive part of this maybe is that because employment is already a highly regulated space in most developed countries, I think there's more of a willingness to do the regulation. Because what I saw, I led a project with the World Economic Forum trying to develop more norms and standards and guidelines for HR professionals. And one of the things I heard from the startups was that they were actually having difficulty convincing companies to use their tool because they were worried about getting in trouble legally, right? There's already equal employment laws. And so the startups even were quite welcoming of regulation because they felt like they needed guidelines to convince the employers that it was safe to use their tools, right? And also a way for them to differentiate because these were the more thoughtful, careful startups and a way to differentiate themselves from the more problematic ones. So I think this is a place where actually there's a lot that we still need to figure out about how regulation should work, but there's actually a willingness, I think, on multiple sides to work together to figure it out. Whether or not, you know, regulation is always a fraught process, whether that will turn out to be a happy outcome, we shall see. I think it's this balance between over-regulation versus addressing actually a bit of a stymie right now because everyone's afraid to move, right? We've now learned that AI can be biased and have problematic outcomes. And so there's a bit of a paralysis where organizations are a little bit afraid to do anything more in the risk of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Matisa. Well, let's see how you've been watching, how you feel about diving in with AI. Were you to be trying to get a job through it? We have a poll. We had a poll with 2 questions. We've got the results. The first question was, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable with AI shortlisting candidates? And the second question was, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable being interviewed by artificial intelligence? Well, let me bring you the results. The response to, if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable with AI shortlisting candidates, is that only a quarter of you, just over 26.4%, said, yeah, I'd be fine to be shortlisted like that. No, an overwhelming 73.6% of you, almost 3 out of 4 of you who've taken part, said you wouldn't like to be shortlisted by AI. That said, when it came to being interviewed, well, the response was a little bit different. If you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable being interviewed by AI? Yes, 52.3% said yes, and 47.7% of you said no. So jumping wildly to conclusions, Matisa, I think I'll come to you with this one. There's a suggestion that we don't want people to shortlist us. We don't want to be shortlisted by a computer or by AI, but actually we'd probably rather be interviewed. Maybe it's because we don't like being interviewed by people, full stop.
Yeah, I'm really surprised by those results. I think part of it may be how people are imagining the shortlisting versus the interviewing, right? So the shortlisting, is it really truly the AI system? How short is that list? I guess maybe people would be willing to have AI medium list them, right? But they want the human to come to the final short list for the interview. Because at the moment, right, as I said, there's many people who get screened out by much less sophisticated systems before a human ever looks at them. And so using that tool to actually create a better list for the human to review might be good. But to have the computer decide all the way down to who gets interviewed, I guess, is maybe what people are worried about. Whereas the interviewing, I guess the question is, what's happening with that interview? Is the AI just running the interview and the human reviews the results? Or is the AI making a decision about that interviewing process? And what is it considering, right? There was a lot of controversy with some of these tools that were trying to, I think Nicola was pointing out, right, rate your trustworthiness based on your facial expressions. I'm not so sure that, I think people's answers may have changed if they thought the computer was doing that, right? Making judgments about you based on highly suspicious things. And in fact, it was revealed by one of the companies that was doing that those things were not as predictive. And in fact, they've stopped doing that part because of it. So yeah, interesting results.
Interesting results. And Glenn, this leads me to a question that's come in. Thank you so much, by the way, for bringing in your questions. There are loads coming in. Please send some more in because they're all incredibly interesting. Delia de Vila from the Universidad Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. Good afternoon, Las Palmas. How are soft skills taken into consideration in an AI system for labour market matching? Glenn, that question is aimed at you, and it perhaps brings in the results of the poll, which is still people are really, dare I say it, holding their nose when it comes to interacting with AI. They'd much rather deal with people.
Well, that's an excellent question. I can say from our perspective, that's something that we avoid because of the risks associated with it. I mentioned it before, when you're trying to use, there's so many challenges associated with trying to use artificial intelligence to gauge someone's soft skills. I do think that's an area where humans can still bring value for sure. But it's an interesting mix, right? Because on the one hand, you don't have, on either side, you don't have a bias-free solution. People are biased. I think the statistics that you just mentioned previously shows that people are like, well, maybe I would trust AI more in an interview because I think that maybe people judge me during the interview process. And I think that AI would be more fair. And that's interesting, but soft skills are very, I think, challenging for AI to be able to watch someone's video or listen to some audio and then derive. I think, to be honest, I think that's very sketchy. That's something that should be avoided, until there's advancements and then in checks and balances. And there would have to be, as I was mentioning before, significant studies to be able to prove that it does not have adverse impact across many different you have so many challenges with the association of trying to assess soft skills associated with someone's background, their personality, gender identity, age. There's a number of things that are going to be very disabilities, right? I think that's an area of extremely high risk. So it's something that I would recommend at the moment to avoid, if at all possible. And I go back to the point where I feel like that's where humans still add value. And even though humans also, of course, have many different cognitive biases, that it certainly wouldn't be systematic like an AI solution would be as well. At least you'd have variability between people.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for that. Nicola, we've had a question come in. Whoever sent it in, you didn't leave your name, but thank you anyway for the question. Nicolas, what do you think about disclosing whether AI or humans make decisions on employment upfront? It's a very important question, isn't it?
Sorry, can you repeat? I didn't understand.
Of course. What do you think about disclosing whether artificial intelligence or humans have made a decision in employment upfront? Is it possible for companies utilizing AI recruitment tools to obtain meaningful consent from applicants?
It's very complex question because you know it's a relationship, it's a contract, so it's impossible to have a real consent in company. So it's a very I think it's not the good option. I think the good option for this is to have, for example, a protection of fundamental right. It's very important to have that. It's for this, you have the works of for example, for the Council of Europe, they've been working on this. I think it's very important because inside the company, you cannot have the consent, a real consent of a worker. You understand that? So for me, it's so complex to answer in some words. You understand?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that, Nicola. I do need to make a correction to everybody. Either it was humans or artificial intelligence have meant that the poll materialized in exactly the diametrically opposite direction that it was intended. So just to explain that, the questions and the answers now have come out as: if you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable being interviewed by AI? 3/4 of you said no, you wouldn't. You still need people. Wim, how reassuring is that to you, that actually we do really need to see you in order to work out whether we want to work together?
Yeah, well, I think it's not a surprise, and that's why we only use it in enhanced decision making. It's still the human operator who decides. It's still the employer. It's still the unemployed, or it's still the counselor. For us, it's just a question of broadening the perspective, see more possibilities, and use the connecting the dots in the data that might give you new perspectives. But in the end, it's just the person itself who has to make the decision making. So I think that's totally the way how we try to use the benefits of AI.
The second question, thank you for that, Wim. The second question is, we're reversing around again. If you applied for a job, would you feel comfortable with AI shortlisting candidates? The correct poll should have read 52.3% said yes. That means that more than half of you would be happy to have your application shortlisted. I mean, coming to you, Anna Banchuk, what does that say about the need for regulation? When people are already comfortable to have their application shortlisted by AI?
I think one slightly funny lesson that we can learn from this mistake, the automated mistake, is that I think we all felt that there was some reversal, in the answers, but nobody of us dared to overwrite, this decision. Not at all. We took it for granted because it came from the automated system. I think it's great, that people start trusting those systems, and I think in the future it's quite obvious that those systems will be used very broadly. That nobody anymore will be sitting in a closed room with a bunch of printed out CVs and going through them. But I think regulation is still needed to ensure that this process is as fair as possible and as transparent as possible. It is true that humans are biased, and I think whoever of you used to be a HR manager, there used to be trainings on bias and how to prevent it also in human behavior. But I think with AI we have a chance to make this process better than it was with humans. We just need to set the frame well at the beginning, and then we can use these tools in a more comfortable way.
Anna, thank you for that. I'll stay with you for a question from from the audience, from Pabita Sengupta, who's an analyst at AI Hub, ISED, Government of Canada. Hello, Canada. Quickly, if you wouldn't mind, Anna, platformization of work has been shown to reduce benefits to labour as employers no longer have contracts with employees. It changes the nature of an interaction between humans and humans, doesn't it? In a much more profound way than simply recruiting via an app.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to say. You know, in platform works, in this pioneering way that they are doing, this is not just anymore about matching. It's much more than that. It's about supervision and direction and evaluation and so on and so forth. And indeed, in this context, the algorithms start replacing the managers, and in some ways can also conceal the true relationship, the employment relationship between such a platform and the worker. This is also something that we are trying to tackle in this proposal on platform work, trying to make sure that, you know, we can go beyond the algorithm and see how it is used, to what extent it replaces the manager, and find out, you know, whether there is indeed the dependency between the worker and the platform that could point out to an employment relationship.
Wim, thank you very much indeed for that. Wim, you raised your hand on to make a point. One thing I would also like you to address is the issue that we began this session with at the moment with Anna's presentation, the OECD noticing that if you are highly skilled, AI works in your favor in so many ways, and if you are lacking in those, you know, very advanced skills, or you don't have access to the internet in the way that you should do, you really are in trouble. Question for you, Wim.
Well, I don't know if we experience it that way, because what we see is that employers tend to look for candidates rather in a conservative way. They tend to look to degrees, to experience, and sometimes they look for people who are like themselves, where AI, as we use it, can really give different options and can make some suggestions of people that maybe in the first place you wouldn't consider, or they're not top of mind. And I think that can be an advantage for the people as well, because they are considered by more employers thanks to the AI system than they would be in the classical system. And I think that's the way, and that was the point I wanted to make. AI has helped us in the whole process, the evolution we're going through, to be more aware of how we use our data, and the data we already had before AI, how we use our data, if there's bias in that, or how we use that in our decision making. Thinking about that because of AI helps us thinking about that outside of AI. And I think it really helped us to be more aware about all that.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Wim. Let me bring in now from the OECD, Stijn Brucker, who's been sitting waiting patiently. Stijn, could you possibly give us your view for the last couple of minutes? As senior economist and lead of Future of Work initiative at the OECD, what's this session brought you?
Well, thank you, Emma. But first of all, let me just thank you, Emma, for, I think, excellent moderating again, as usual. And also, I'd like to thank all the speakers here who've come to share their expertise in this area, the knowledge. As my colleague Anna mentioned at the beginning of the session, we are actually doing a project on this at the moment. So we're looking at the role of AI in labor market matching. We're looking at the literature. We're carrying out some case studies. But we're also listening to experts like yourselves. So your contributions are really, really valued and will be valuable in shaping our work going forward. So I've jotted down a few key points from today's lesson, session. Luckily, the session will be recorded and will be available to watch again later on, and I certainly will do that. But just in terms of some key points, I think we can all agree that AI is likely to help us improve matching in the labor market, whether it's in terms of the scale or in terms of speed, the costs, but also the quality of the matching that we've mentioned on a number of occasions. But I think we wouldn't have a session here today if we also didn't all agree that there were some challenges, and I think this really has come out. Now, nowhere, I think, have the benefits and risks of AI been more clearly illustrated than in the platform economy, which in many ways was a forerunner when it comes to the use of AI in matching. And we've heard from the EU about their recent proposal around platform work, which is really, it comes on the back of, I think, a lot of concerns around transparency, around privacy, the need for human monitoring, and also the right to contest automated decisions. I think there's a lot of worry around this, and we saw that in the poll that we run during this session. Now, while the platform economy may have been a forerunner, we see these applications making their way into the wider labor market. We've heard about public employment services from WIN that have been investing in these tools with very clear benefits. But also it was interesting to hear from WIN what kind of safeguards they're putting in place to make sure that the use of AI is ethical. And these safeguards, I think, are particularly important in the employment sphere, because we're talking about decisions that can have a very big impact on people's lives. So it's not just, and I think one thing that's important here, it's not just about whether you get a job or not, but even just whether you are shown a vacancy in the first place. And so I think if bias creeps into these kinds of decisions and there are errors and we can't trust the tools, it's really important that we start regulating these tools to some extent. Now, what Glenn mentioned is also very important, is that some applications perhaps are lower risk than other applications. Like, the use of AI in scheduling may be much lower risk than the use of AI in actually interviewing. We've discussed that on a number of occasions. Now, another point that came out of today's session, I think, is that while the risks may be universal across countries, maybe the solutions may not be exactly the same. And I think Matissa's intervention has kind of suggested that in North America and in Canada and the US, the approach may be slightly different from what is being taken in Europe, but also in other parts of the OECD. Now, finally, I think what's also important that we shouldn't forget about this is that there are many workers also involved in the matching process itself. And as Nicola pointed out, we also need to think about their jobs and the quality of their jobs. But anyway, I will stop here. I'd like to thank all of you again, not just the speakers, but also the audience for your participation. And I really look forward to continuing this conversation with you over future OECD events. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stijn. And that brings us to the end of this hour-long discussion. My thanks to Anna Milanez, Labour Market Economist at the OECD, for kicking things off an hour ago. Wim Adriens from the Flemish Public Employment Service in Belgium. Glenn Cathy, Head of Digital Strategy at the recruitment company Randstad, based out of Tampa, Florida. Batista Hollister, Assistant Professor of Organisational Behaviour at McGill University, joining us from a snowy Montreal. Nicolas Blanc, who's National Delegate for Digital at CFC-CGC, General Confederation of Executives.
Well done.
Merci. Anna Vanchuk, Deputy Head of Unit, Future of Work, Youth Employment in the European Commission, and Stijn Brucker, Senior Economist and Lead of Future Work Initiative at the OECD. Thank you all so much for joining in on today's panel. Thank you for watching and for asking such important questions. I'm sure this is just the beginning of a debate. But do stay on, because in the next session we'll be looking as to whether AI can read and count. I'm terrified by that prospect, and whether it can do so better than human beings. Join us in about a quarter of an hour, 5 p.m. 1700 CET for that. So thank you very much indeed for your time. Stay on for that. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, thank you very much for watching and taking part. Goodbye.